From the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., this is Rendezvous with History, a podcast that captures the drama of presidential decision-making. Dr. Anthony Eames sits down with prominent scholars and leading citizens to bring to life what happens in the White House and how it shapes the world.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Hello and welcome to Rendezvous with History, a podcast from the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C. I am a guest host, Joshua Tait, a postdoctoral fellow here at the Institute, and today I am glad to be joined by Professor Kevin M. Schultz. Kevin is the professor and chair of the History Department at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He's the author of several books, including Buckley and Mailer, The Difficult Friendship That Shaped the 60s, and the just published Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, Including White Liberals, A History, published by the University of Chicago Press. Kevin, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
When someone told me the title of your new book, which again is Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, I actually laughed because it doesn't sound like the type of book you typically get from a university press. And it kind of reminded me of some of the books you mention in the book, ones by provocateurs like Laura Ingraham or Dinesh D'Souza. Tell me about your title and tell me why this book, why now?
Well, I'm glad you laughed. That's definitely a part of the tone of the book, is to have a good time and to tell historical stories with a bit of sense of humor and seeing humor in the past. The other reason I'm glad you laughed is because so many people have had so much fun at the expense of liberals over the last 50 years that I wanted to have kind of a cheeky title that would lend itself to the tone of a lot of the critiques. And so where did the title come from? Good question. I, like many Americans, was completely struck by the amount of polarization we've had in American life in the last 50 years, or maybe 20 years, or maybe the last 10 years. We could pick a starting point and go from there. And I was very concerned about the fate of democracy and all these major big questions. And you mentioned one of my previous books on William F. Buckley Jr. and Norman Mailer and their friendship in the 1960s. And my book before that was about religious tolerance in the middle of the 20th century. And all of these people in this time about 75 years ago were operating in the notion that there was this grand centrist tradition in American life. And that centrist tradition was called liberalism. Mm-hmm. And so I started to compare my current preoccupations with political polarization and how the either the right and the left seem to be pulling the country apart with the previous work where there was this grand centrist tradition. And I kind of wanted to know what happened to liberalism. Why had liberal become such a bad word in our time? And it was interesting to me as I started to suss out these ideas at professional conferences, talking with friends at cocktail parties, things like that. I learned really quickly that if I was talking to friends who are conservatives, they had a very different understanding of what a liberal was and why they hated liberals and white liberals in particular. And then if I was talking to my friends who were farther left, the Bernie Bros or any of these sort of, fans of AOC, they had a very different understanding of what a liberal was. And if I was talking to some of my mostly Black, but sometimes Latino friends, they had a very different reason for hating white liberals. And so there were all these collection of people, and they all hated white liberals. And there was this sort of grand centrist tradition that everybody was pulling apart. And so I was having a conversation with my wife, and she and I were laughing about this sort of notion that why does everybody hate all these people? What awful things have they done? And so she's actually the one who said, your book should be called Why Everyone Hates White Liberals. And then I added, including white liberals, because there's this sense that white liberals bear some of the blame for this self-hatred. So that's where the title came from. I'm glad you laughed. It's meant to be fun. The tone of the book is historical, of course, but it's meant to sort of have this sort of humorous and sly interest. So I'm glad you picked up on that.
Well, I think the idea that there are multiple people defining and disliking and defining themselves against liberals is such a keen insight. And one thing I liked about the book, and I'm not sure if it comes through on the screen, is how reflective the cover is. You almost literally see yourself in it, which adds to, I guess, the joke. But can you give us some history? When we talk about white liberals, you've said grand centrist tradition. who are we really talking about, and when do we start talking about white liberals?
Okay, good question. I'm gonna sort of nerd out here for a second and do a
By
little
all means.
etymology. Yeah, do a little etymology of the word liberal and where it comes from, and that is the way that it makes sense to answer your question.
Hmm.
So liber is Latin, which means free, right?
Hmm.
So free can mean many, many, many different things, and um, so how does it come to mean what it means? So if we look at the word as it morphs over time in Shakespeare's era, 500 years ago plus, liberal meant sort of generosity of spirit, somebody who could be generous with their wealth or generous in encountering somebody who was outside their tribe, their circle of the we. And then as universities sort of grew, it grew from that sort of generosity of spirit to be sort of broad-minded would be the
Hmm.
phrase that I would use. And most of the listeners may have college educations here and they had a liberal arts
Yeah.
education. So that arrives in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century to sort of signify something that is not vocational. So a vocational education is you want to become a plumber, you get plumbing training or whatever it is, a lawyer, you get legal training. And a liberal arts education means you're interested in poetry and literature and history and philosophy and politics. It's broad-minded in that
Mhm.
sensibility. And then in the 17th and 18th century, religious tolerance gets added to this, to the definition of what it means to be liberal. So now you're broad-minded, you're open-minded, you're engaging in many different pursuits, and you are accepting to some extent or another religious diversity. You might not want to welcome people who are inviting non-capital T truths into this world, but you don't think they should be burned at the stake. You're going to
Okay, right.
tolerate these people. And then the grand political revolutions happen of the 18th and 19th century. We usually think of the French Revolution and, of course, the American Revolution, 1776, 1789, these kinds of things. And these revolutions lend political rights and political definitions to the word liberal, which means if you are a liberal in this period, going back to John Locke and some of the founding philosophers, it becomes a definition that means you have a right to certain entitlements. You have a right to certain say in how politics are. There's a representative government is a key component of this. And that's what it means to be liberal. And the whole thing that underlies this whole moment and the meaning of liberal, I would say, is, of course, it stems from the Latin free. So
Hmm.
you're trying to free yourselves from the yoke of authority.
Hmm.
And as the yokes of authority change, freedom changes. So if the yoke of authority is the Catholic Church over Europe, right, you want to be free from that. And so you're going to embrace religious tolerance. If the yoke is kings and queens and guillotines, then freedom is going to have this political component of it. And so today, when we refer to classical liberalism, oftentimes we're talking about capitalism and this sort of 19th century vision of what liberalism is. And that derives from the notion that capitalism, especially small market capitalism, small business owners, that was the ticket to freedom outside of kings and queens and royal authority. You would gain some income, gain some wealth, gain some power through running a successful business. And that's where this sort of 19th century liberalism, how to be free in the 19th century, meant, among other things, that you were engaged in a market economy and you were using that market economy freely in order to have your own power. And then getting to the answer of your question, finally, I told you I was going to nerd out, but getting to the answer of your question here, after the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th, the 19th and 20th, the late 19th and 20th century, where you have names like Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and all of these sort of big capitalists, the capitalists themselves become those people that are keeping workers down, those people that are keeping farmers down. And you get a sort of a wide push against these people.
Hmm.
So these are the people who are now deemed to be restricting freedoms. And so as liberalism had done in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century, in the 20th century, we get a new understanding of what liberalism is. And it's really FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who gets elected president in 1932 in the depths of the Great Depression. He, as we all know, probably promotes this idea called the New Deal, which is this transformation about how the government is involved in Americans' life and how the government can be an active tool to counter big business. And I found this was one of the big finds in my research. I was really excited about this find. He's trying to find a word while he's campaigning for president in 1932. He's trying to find a word to describe this that is not going to be dismissed as socialism or communism, because he wants greater government intervention in the economy. He wants some government planning, but not huge government planning. He wants to shore up the sort of pillars of capitalism. That's his goal, but he doesn't want to be subject to tarnishment as a socialist, which has radical connotations. So in the campaign in the summer of 1932, I found him fishing for a word. And in one particular speech, he says, "We are the party of liberalism. We are the party of this new kind of freedom." Rex Tugwell, who was one of his political advisors at the time, was later asked, where did he come up with this word liberal? And Rex Tugwell said, "I don't know. I actually asked FDR once." And FDR just looked at me and said, "Does it matter?" And so we never got a real source for where FDR found it. Of course, he knew about the British Liberal Party that goes back to the middle of the 19th century. He knew about journals like the New Republic that had toyed with this word in the early decades of the 20th century in the United States. But this was just one of many tested words, and then all of a sudden it becomes his go-to. He hardly ever used it before 1932, and throughout the 1930s, he uses it over and over and over again. The collected volume that he has for his speeches in 1938 is called The Continued Struggle for Liberalism. And so from then on, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, liberalism means this sort of government intervention to counterbalance the strength of big business. And that's the definition of liberalism that we all have been operating under for much of the 20th and 21st centuries.
It's such a fascinating backstory. And one of the things I really liked about the book is you give it more or less a definite start date, which is in the American context, which is Roosevelt using it in a political campaign. And you kind of suggest that there was a period of peak liberalism that ran from 1933 until the mid-1960s. Would you characterize then kind of a liberal establishment, or a liberal, to use slightly loaded language, or an in-group that really was in power?
So that's a complicated question. There was, to borrow the historian Gary Gersell's phrase, there was a liberal order, which is to say there is a common set of ideas that both parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, sort of agreed upon. And it was that government intervention in the economy was perhaps the best way to stabilize an economy and to shore up capitalism, and to ensure the radicalisms of the left especially, but also from the right, stayed out of our politics, so that the government could do the work of building what turned out to be in the 1960s the largest middle class our country has ever seen by percentage. So I do think there was this sensibility from the 30s all the way through the 60s from both Republican and Democratic Party politicians and presidents, that they sort of embraced this. To give one example that I cite in the book, Dwight Eisenhower, of course, Republican president in the 1950s, when he wanted to sort of shore up the economy at a moment of potential recession, he invested government dollars into the military and bought and expanded more military contracts, which he knew would then go to private industries like Boeing and places like that. And then that would end up in the pockets of American consumers, who would then buy new houses, and they would buy new washing machines, and they would expand the American economy. So there was this strong sensibility that the government could be useful. And this came in from both parties. So there was this liberal order that was generally agreed upon by most politically minded Americans. I think that's very safe to say. And that's why Gary Gersell, this great historian, calls it an order. I do think, to get to your other question, which is a little bit loaded, is there sort of a liberal establishment? Is there a liberal elite? And that's sort of a more difficult question, because sure, there was, today it's been labeled the deep state, but sure, there was this group of bureaucrats that came to Washington, D.C. to administer all of these government programs that FDR puts in place during the New Deal, and that Eisenhower continues in the 1950s. And so there is this sort of sense that there were all these thousands and thousands of people coming to Washington, D.C., and they're propagating certain ideals, and they're putting into practice these ideals in American life. And there are certain people who are defenders of it. They're journalists, they're active politicians. I don't think they would ever really see themselves as a
Right.
sort of liberal establishment or a liberal elite. And only when the attacks start in the 1950s and 1960s on this centrist philosophy of liberalism do they get labeled as this liberal elite, as this liberal establishment. And it's always done sort of perniciously to tarnish the reputation of these people, to say these elitists, this establishment is telling you what to think, is telling you how you should live your life. And so it's meant as a damning term in a way. But so yes, there did exist this sort of body of people who identified with these ideals and put them into practice and articulated and defended them. But I don't think there was some pernicious sort of fountainheady kind of elite that's trying to promulgate ideas that into the American population.
So it's an order, a shared set of assumptions, a perception, but not necessarily a governing caste.
Correct. And I really like your shared set of assumptions. That's a really nice way to think about it, where a large center of Americans assumed the government should work in certain ways. And it did. And the reason so many people agreed on it is because for a large number of Americans, it was working out just fine.
Sure.
You know, you saw the impoverished people from the Great Depression get elevated to the middle class in the 1940s and 50s with the help of New Deal programs. And of course, with the help of the federal government during World War II, and then aftermath with things like the GI Bill, for sure.
At the same time, you end up with some people who fall out or feel like they fall outside of the liberal consensus, so to speak. And you have this great line in your introduction that I think sums up the argument really vividly on the question of what happened to white liberals. You say, quote, "The short answer then as to why so many people hate white liberals is that it was an assassination. It was cold-hearted, deliberate, and designed to transfer power in America." And then you go on to write, "And in perhaps a surprising turn of events, it turns out that there wasn't just a single shooter in this assassination. Instead, there were multiple gunmen firing from different angles." Now, this is not about JFK. I'm gonna get Anthony to cut that out. I will get him to cut that out. That's a terrible joke. I'm just gonna read. And then you go on to write, "And in perhaps a surprising turn of events, it turns out that there wasn't just a single shooter in this assassination. Instead, there were multiple gunmen firing from different angles." So tell us about this assassination argument.
Well, as I mentioned, I was sort of fascinated by the notion that my friends on the right and my friends on the left and my friends who are more social justice minded or who are reading Ibram X. Kendi, they all had very different understandings of what a liberal was and what the centrist position in American life was. And I traced that sort of argument back to see if that existed and how it emerged. And what I found really surprised me. So what didn't surprise me, just sort of because of my previous work on William F. Buckley, was that starting in the 1950s, William F. Buckley begins a coalition of conservative right-wing thinkers, actors around the journal National Review. I probably don't need to tell the listeners at the Ronald Reagan Institute about this sort of story. But what I found that was really interesting was that on the right, people, including William F. Buckley, were sort of realizing that if we wanted to sort of rally around something, communism or anti-communism only carried us so far. So we all know that Buckley's magic trick was bringing together sort of the libertarian right, the traditionalist right, the religious right, as we now know it, but they didn't call it that then, and bringing together these people who had really different understandings of what conservative meant. And he could sort of blanket over the differences that they had through a staunch anti-communism. Well, we're all against, communism. We're all for an activist Cold War. We want to roll back instead of contain communism, these kinds of arguments. But that only carried itself so far for Buckley, and he needed an internal enemy. And I saw him fish around for words, communalism, communitarianism versus individualism. There were all these phrases that he was sort of searching for to find, and nothing really stuck until starting in the mid-1950s, he landed on the word liberal. And he said, we need to rally around and create an opposition to the liberal magazines that are setting the tone for, this was his phrase, he invented a phrase you already used, the liberal establishment. He always capitalized the L and the E in the liberal establishment because it was this block out there that was dictating to Americans what to think, and they were cutting people out. And so he actually started this tradition of seeing conservatives as outside this liberal mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
And he began to sort of badger and badger and badger the liberal establishment, the liberal elite, in order to create more space for his conservative movement. And he does this very successfully. His famous book of 1959 is called Up from Liberalism, of course, stealing its title from Up from Slavery, thereby comparing liberalism of mid-20th century to chattel slavery of the 1850s, unsubtly making that comparison there. And he wanted that book to be called I Smell the Blood of a Liberal, but the publisher wouldn't go for it. So he came up with Up from Liberalism. And this anti-liberalism, opposing the liberal elite that's out to tackle you, was the sort of central move that he makes in the 1950s and 1960s. And that carries all the way to today with some transition through, Ronald Reagan, all the way through Rush Limbaugh and into Donald Trump and the Trump era today. But then what I found that was surprising, I started looking to the left. I started looking at guys like Saul Alinsky, and I started looking at Dissent magazine, which was sort of a counterpart to National Review on the socialist left, with Irving Howe and all of these left-wing thinkers. I started looking at the sort of counterculture left of the 1960s. And all of these people positioned themselves not in opposition to William F. Buckley conservatism, which they sort of discarded as unserious and as too small to really care about. But how they positioned themselves is in opposition to this liberal center. And they hated liberalism too. They thought liberals were just sort of beards for capitalists. They were just sort of protecting the establishment. They wanted to bring about a suburban lifestyle with white picket fences, and that was not what Jerry Garcia, the guitarist for the Grateful Dead, wanted, right? He wanted to imagine something completely different that was more premised in socialism rather than in sort of a mainstream liberalism. And so he had a completely different understanding of what a liberal was compared to William F. Buckley. So we've got Buckley, who sees liberals as like the gateway drug to socialism and communism. Then we've got Saul Alinsky and Irving Howe and Jerry Garcia and all these people who see liberalism as just a beard for capitalism, who are trying to bring about middle class. And then I started to look at the civil rights movement. I really wanted to write a book about James Baldwin. It never really came about because other people were writing so many good books about James Baldwin that there wasn't that much room for me. But one of the things that I realized,
for example.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things I realized was that in 1963, 64, 65, we actually get to see a transition from James Baldwin, who had great hope in white liberals helping out the civil rights movement and bringing about true equality. And then by 64, 65, this frustration creeps in. And by 65, 66, 67, this general hatred of white liberals who are only halfway friends, who are not willing to give up anything in order to have true racial equality. And I thought, I wonder if other people echo this. And not only did I find that they did, but it was almost universal, and you could almost chart the timeline exactly. You get historians like Lerone Bennett, you get poets like Gwendolyn Brooks, you get playwrights like Lorraine Hansberry, and you get people, and this was actually kind of the most surprising to me, people who are so much in the mainstream of liberal America, people like Martin Luther King Jr., and you get to see in 1963, 64, 65, this transition of MLK's speeches from hoping and embracing white moderates, white liberals who are going to help them achieve the promised land, to turning against them, saying these people are never going to be willing to help us. And so if you think people in the centrist tradition like Martin Luther King are turning, just imagine what the Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X's are doing. Sure. They're already there. So holy cow, you get this three-pronged attack. And it really sets the course for everything that you start seeing in the 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way through the Dead Kennedys on the left, that famous punk band, to go into a terrible joke, that is their name of their band, of course, which is meant to shock, right? All the way through, I mentioned Ibram X. Kendi, and what is his big thing that he's talking about? You've got the racial egalitarians on one side, you've got the racists on the other side, and in the middle are the assimilationists who you can't trust. Well, and what are they more than just the white liberals that James Baldwin and Martin Luther King castigated 50, 60 years ago? So I was struck that there was all this attack coming from many different ways. I started to imagine like a circular firing squad trying to kill liberalism. And then when liberalism falls dead, are they all going to shoot each other? Maybe that's where we are today. But that's sort of what shocked me. It wasn't just a single-pronged attack from the right, which I think a lot of people will look at the title of the book and say, that's what this is. But that's not at all what happened.
I think that's a really useful contribution the book makes because, and maybe this speaks to the success of the right wing or conservative, I guess, attack on liberalism. But so often we allied, or so often the liberals get allied with the left and I guess different minority critiques of liberalism. And you've done a very good job exploding them and showing the tensions between the two, or the perceived and real tensions. I wonder, when reading it, you touch on this a bit and you use Arthur Schlesinger Jr. as the mechanism for it, but does liberalism change during this period or afterwards? And if so, how? Because I think about the neoconservatives, men and women like Irving Kristol or Jean Kirkpatrick or Norman Podhoretz, and they felt, rightly or wrongly, that they hadn't changed, but liberalism had, and it led them famously into the Republican Party. You use Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the book a few times, and he comes across as like this last-ditch defender of liberalism, which I think is in a lot of ways a really fair characterization. But what about his friends who moved further to the right? Were they overreacting, or did something really change in liberalism?
I think both.
Mm-hmm.
I think both is the right answer.
Mm-hmm.
I think something did change in liberalism, and I think liberals themselves today are continuing to argue over that, which is sort of the parenthetical component of my title, which is why everyone hates liberals, and then in parentheses it says including white liberals.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I describe it, and I'm borrowing language, as you mentioned, from Arthur Schlesinger, the historian and John F. Kennedy advisor, what happened in the New Deal was what came to be called something called quantitative liberalism. Now, Franklin Roosevelt didn't call it this. This is something we're putting on after the fact, but it's really useful to think about what that version of liberalism was intending to do, which is, again, to use the power of the state to work on numbers, quantitative stuff. So how can we raise impoverished people to the middle class so that they can, to go back to the word freedom and free of liber, so that they can then be free and exercise their rights as free people in the United States. A lot of that was about raising up impoverished people to the middle class and then allowing those people to do what they will from there, sort of raising the floor so that people could have access to middle class life and then make from it there. It was really quantitative program based on numbers, based on reducing the rate of unemployment. Remember, during the Great Depression, the national unemployment percentage was 25%. And in some industrial cities like Detroit, Chicago, it was as high as 50%. So this was an emergency, and we needed to lower those numbers. We needed to give people money. We needed to shore up the foundations of capitalism. It was very much a numbers-based approach. After World War II, after the expansion of the GI Bill and the expansion of government largesse, after the growth of the American economy in this post-war recovery, a lot of those impoverished people in the 1930s were now middle-class citizens. So what was liberalism going to be? So starting in the 50s, there is this transition and this discussion about what liberalism should become. And the phrase that Arthur Schlesinger gave us and that I really find useful is there was a transition from quantitative liberalism of the New Deal to qualitative liberalism of the 1950s, which really goes into effect during the Great Society of the 1960s during LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson's presidency. Now, this qualitative liberalism wasn't solely about economic numbers, although it was, but it was also about beautifying, highways, and it was about expanding people's access to the arts. This is when the National Endowment for the Arts gets founded. The NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, gets founded. This is continuing to provide opportunities for higher education. This is when a lot of the Great Society transformations happen, and it's no longer purely about ensuring class equalities, but it's more about improving the quality of life. Now, there are kind of two problems with that. One is the question of who gets to define what quality of life is, right? Is having higher education going to improve the quality of life? That is an open question. I think yes, but I would entertain an argument that no. And with somebody who is very interested in happiness as a topic, having more money and having higher education, sure, at a certain level brings more happiness, but at a certain level that also peters out on happiness. So it provokes questions of what the government should be doing in order to create people to be free and open them up to the possibilities. The other thing that it does is that it intersects at this moment with the civil rights movement. which is, of course, in full throttle in the 1960s, the middle 1960s, especially, and during the Great Society expansion as well. And this builds a lot of resentment, especially from the middle class, especially the white working class, who feel like, yes, they're making middle class income. They've got union protected jobs. They're making high hourly wages, but they're not exactly secure in their status. They don't have generational wealth. They don't necessarily own their own homes. They're mortgaged, things like this. And they sort of feel like they're not quite there yet. And then at that moment, they start to see the government in the Great Society give lots of benefits to Black people. And then that expands to women during the women's rights movement. And we could go on from there to the gay rights movement. And these kinds of sort of frustrations and resentments that I'm not exactly secure either. And now you're moving me out of the way in order to ensure these other people have a clearer pathway to middle class life, builds these sort of interracial tensions and these resentments. And I think this is when the moment of white liberal gets placed on that. And this intersects with another monstrosity out there, which is the Vietnam War and the anti-Vietnam War protests, which also takes place in the mid-1960s and late 1960s. And so it's at that moment in this 1960s period when liberalism gets tarred, with some understandable reasons, with being too eager to ensure racial equality and prioritizing the needs of racial minoritized people. And also it gets tarred with having this sort of foreign policy that is overly aggressive and that is not exactly spending our coin inside our own country, but shipping our dollars outside the country. And I think that's when these sort of arguments that I outlined earlier really begin to escalate and really begin to tear apart the center of American life. So I do think that liberalism does shift in that period, and I think that invites and opens it up to a lot of contentious arguments that I do think, to get to your question, these sort of neocons who were part of the Democratic Party who shift away, they get frustrated with this new qualitative Great Society vision of what liberalism is. And so many of them say, I'm still a liberal, but liberalism has shifted away. I'm more of a so Jeane Kirkpatrick actually says this directly, I'm a New Deal liberal, but that version of liberalism is no longer in the Democratic Party. It is now more in the Republican Party, she thinks. But she actually doesn't think that. She actually tries to start a third party. She tries to start this like new democratic vision, and that falls flat because of the third party tradition in American life. And so then she finds herself moving over to the Republican Party.
One of the ways I read your book was that the answers of New Deal liberalism lost their efficacy in the late 1960s, the Vietnam War, and then especially the inflation and the economic context of the 1970s. I wonder, where does Ronald Reagan fit into this story? As we know, he voted for Roosevelt all 4 times, but he became disillusioned with liberalism, or perhaps with qualitative rather than quantitative liberalism in the 1950s especially. Did he play a role in the assassination of liberalism, you think?
Absolutely, he did. He wasn't sort of one of these foundational figures that I sort of outlined already from the 50s and 60s and 70s. But in the 70s especially, he really picks up the baton and becomes sort of one of the chief abusers of what he calls the liberals, the liberal tradition in American life. We all know the story of Ronald Reagan, where he, as you say, voted for Roosevelt all 4 times. I have a few quotations here because I love. He's one of these guys that when you start quoting Ronald Reagan, you can't stop. There's a few people out there that it's like the words are so useful and they're so elegant that you just want to have these big block quotes, and then your editor says, sorry, you got to cut this down. He described himself as a near hopeless hemophiliac liberal.
Oh, funny.
He was this hopeful guy who thought, that the world could bring about this sort of profound egalitarian promise. And he, as we famously know, was reading the National Review on his train rides across the country. And he says, the pages of the National Review really educated him in the problems with what William F. Buckley called the liberal establishment. He wrote a letter to Buckley in 1962 that said, "I'd be lost without National Review." And so he was really trained, and his politics were really formed in this William F. Buckley sensibility that there was this liberal establishment that is promoting a certain vision, and that in order to create space for an alternate voice, we need to attack those liberals. And so Reagan, of course, his political sort of key moment is in 1964 when he gives a time of choosing speech. This is a very famous speech that I'm sure all the listeners know. And of course, the most famous line from that probably is, "The trouble with our liberal friends is not that they're ignorant, it's just they know so much that isn't so." Right? So he's already attacking this sort of liberal establishment, even as early as 1964, something he'd learned from the pages of the National Review. And then he realizes the political utility of this throughout the late 1960s. As what we talked about earlier, the civil rights movement begins to grow in its radicalism and even its violence. The Vietnam War and anti-Vietnam War movement begins to disrupt the streets of the United States. Law and order seems to be, out of control. And of course, Richard Nixon uses that phrase to get elected in 1968. I love that fact, by the way. Most people think of the 1960s as all these dope smoking hippies, but you got to remember that Richard Nixon was elected president in 1968, so he's very much a part of the 60s as well. And Reagan recognizes that there is this political usefulness in mocking the liberals, and he really ups the ante in the 1970s. After his governorship, he goes on and becomes a political commentator in newspapers and radios, and on some famous 60 Minutes interview, all he does is sort of excoriate the liberals. I have one line here that, if you don't mind me reading it, because it's so telling. He says in 1975 on 60 Minutes, "If fascism ever comes to America, it will come in the form of liberalism." And what is fascism? Fascism is private ownership, private enterprise, but total government control and regulation. Well, isn't that the liberal philosophy? And later he says fascism was really the basis of the New Deal. Now, of course, this elides over the fact that New Deal liberals were actually the ones who fought the real-life fascists in World War II. So he skips over that part. And he also performs this movement that the right really capitalizes on. Buckley started it, Reagan perfects it, and now it's all over the place, all over the right-wing media, which is to sort of push to its extreme what liberalism is. In other words, no liberal in his or her own right mind would say that liberalism is private ownership, private enterprise, but total control and regulation. Nobody thinks the government should have no liberal thinks that the government should have this. But nonetheless, it doesn't matter. Reagan helps create this specter, creates this imaginary vision of what the liberal is. And he uses that specter, and he beats it during the 1980 election. And he goes on to, of course, famously triumphantly win in 1980, as we well know. And throughout the 1980s, liberalism is almost completely defeated. There are no politicians who are claiming to be liberal at all. And so he sort of cools his jets a little bit on sort of flogging the dead horse, as it were. And only in 1988, as he's watching his, sort of handpicked successor, George Herbert Walker Bush, lose in polls to Michael Dukakis, that Reagan says, "Hey, we've got the plan of attack here. We've got to attack Dukakis as this Massachusetts, Harvard-educated elite liberal that is going to bring about the 60s radicalism all over again." And actually, George Herbert Walker Bush says, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go negative. And as he starts falling in the polls, all of a sudden, a lot of Bush's advisors who had been Reagan men, including guys like Lee Atwater, say, George Bush, you've got to use this attack line. It's this amazing attack line, and it's going to work. So starting in the mid-1980s, mid-1988, in the summer of 1988, all of a sudden what the Bush campaign becomes is this slash and burn attack, painting Michael Dukakis as the quintessential liberal. And Reagan then all of a sudden feels enlivened, and he goes on the attack on his radio addresses, on his nationwide tours. He travels twice a week during the summer and fall of the election. And what is his stump speech? Attacking Dukakis for bringing back 1960s liberalism. My famous little stat, I love stats and data and things like that. Ronald Reagan gives a 25-minute speech at the Republican National Convention that nominates George Herbert Walker Bush to the presidency, or at least to be the nominee. And he uses in that 25-minute speech the word liberal or liberalism 22 times. And he only mentions Bush 6 times. And he says, I'm going to quote again, yes, the choice this year is between the policies of liberalism or the policies of America's political mainstream. It's time to use the dreaded L word, Reagan says, to say the policies of our opposition and the congressional leadership of his party are liberal, liberal, liberal. So he's painting liberals as the Democratic Party, and they're going to bring about chaos. They're going to bring about the marches in the streets, and that's what liberalism is. So Reagan, sort of shows the way for many Republican politicians from all the way to this most recent election, that if you really want to create a divide, you paint your opposition as liberal. And there was a few moments in this most recent election, the 2024 election, where Donald Trump was painting Kamala Harris as too liberal for the mainstream of America. I collected those. I was writing a book on it, so I had to collect these headlines, right? And he was following the Reagan playbook.
I think you're right in that Reagan, and then that dynamic carries on so clearly. Polarization by attacking liberals. Your argument just now has made me think, to what extent have left-wing activists been complicit in that, and has it undermined, I guess, the left bloc or the liberal left bloc within American politics? I think about voters who might have been Bernie Sanders voters and then Trump voters or something like that. Is that a flow-on from this story that you tell?
Yeah, in some ways. Look, the left in America has been at its strongest when the more radical left and the moderate center have formed a coalition. This is what the New Deal was. This was even some of the early 1960s JFK and early Great Society, Medicare, Medicaid, these very, very, very popular programs. This is sort of the center and the left coming together. And I would say that as the left grew increasingly frustrated that it wasn't getting what it wanted as quickly as it wanted, it found utility in attacking the liberal center. And that caused a rift between the center and the radical left. Now, where the word liberal is a whole different story that you'll have to read my book to get to, because I can nerd out on that if you want. But what it means towards your question is that when the right, from Ronald Reagan all the way to Don Bongino to Donald Trump, are attacking liberals, there's really nobody who is defending the liberal tradition. Right. You get, as you mentioned, Daniel Patrick Moynihan is sort of the last defender of the liberal tradition. Ted Kennedy, he sort of tried to defend the Kennedy liberal tradition, but he was so afraid of the word that he never really tapped into liberalism as the thing that he wanted to revive. Some Democrats, some of whom you mentioned, who are now sort of neocons, they were Democrats at one point. They tried to revitalize a vision of liberalism. The word just sort of had too much baggage, basically, that the tradition was really sort of not solidified in any way, and people were afraid to claim it as their own.
Well, that gets to your final provocation, which is perhaps it's time to ditch the term. If you're a partisan of liberalism, get over it, I suppose, is kind of your argument. Find something new. How tenable is that?
That's the open question, right? So yes, this is the provocation of the book is, as I was doing the research, as I was exploring what liberalism is and how it has morphed over the course of the 20th and 21st century, I encountered all these books by these sort of centrist thinkers in American life with huge platforms, and they were demanding a revitalization of liberalism. Adam Gopnik is sort of maybe the most recent, the New Yorker writer, who is sort of this polymath intellectual, sometimes an elegant writer, but sometimes it gets a little saccharine sweet. And he has this whole book about revitalizing liberalism and teaching your young radical children what this grand tradition is. Eric Alterman is another voice, sort of a little more far to the left, demanding that we bring back fighting liberalism of the World War II era. Jill Lepore wrote a book trying to revitalize the liberal tradition, and on and on and on. David Leinart is trying to bring back liberalism, even to this day, sort of an Ezra Klein abundance capitalism, abundance liberalism is trying to bring back a certain kind of liberalism, and most of these books just fall flat. They might have a moment and they might be exciting, but they don't really carry weight. And in part, I argue that the word liberalism has too much baggage, that if you try and bring it back, it's too soft of a target right now. Donald Trump is going to immediately paint Kamala Harris as too liberal. The people on the radical left, the Bernie bros, they're the ones, they hate liberalism too because it's been sort of undermined. You look at those people who are marching on the streets for BLM, the Black Lives Matter campaign, they don't trust a good centrist liberal because of the promises unfulfilled of the past. And so I think that the word has too much baggage. And yet I'm struck by something else. And this something else is actually something that Elon Musk said recently in his Twitter spat with Donald Trump, where he said he was going to remove himself from the Republican Party and start a third party that actually embodies the ideas and beliefs of the grand center 80% of American life, which are now currently not represented by the Democrat or Republican parties. And I actually, as much as I have problems with Elon Musk, I've found this in Gallup polls and in my research. If you look at issue after issue, whether that issue is abortion or gun safety laws or how much government intervention should there be in the economy, Americans poll in the shape of a bell curve, right? Where at either end of extreme, the percentage is real low, and then it goes up in the middle. So to use just one example, for 50 years, an overwhelmingly large percentage of Americans believe on the issue of abortion that first trimester abortion should be legal, and anything after that should be illegal to the point unless they're risking the life of the mother or the baby, and then there are open conversations about what that should be. But the extremes of no abortion anytime or abortion all the time are such minor percentages of the American population's belief, and yet those are a lot of the loudest voices that we hear. So I do think that there is still this liberalism, there is still this grand centrist tradition in American life. But I think if anybody tries to capture that and call themselves liberal, they're just going to fall flat. So I end my book proposing a bunch of different terms, none of which I think are that great. I'll admit that straight up front. And I might be optimistic about a few, but I'm not very hopeful because they'll just be tarred as well. So I haven't quite seen anybody come up with the right phraseology to describe this center liberal position that you can't call liberal anymore. But I do think it's fascinating. I found this fascinating thing, okay? And it gets to your point about sort of Bernie Sanders, who happens to be right now the most popular politician in America, if you look at polling data. I was struck by the fact that in the late 1960s, the white working class was sort of falling out with the Democratic Party and the New Deal coalition, but they weren't sure they wanted to become Republicans, which had been the party of sort of the elite rich guys and the corporate order, things like that, right? So where are they going to land? It was an open question, right? And at their worst, they could fall towards George Wallace, and they could fall into the sort of segregationist sort of base mentality of that. And one thing that really struck me that I found fascinating was the large percentage of the white working class in polling data favored Robert Kennedy in the election of 1968. And then, of course, as we all know, Robert Kennedy was assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan in a hotel in Los Angeles. And of course, his candidacy was over, obviously, because he was dead. So where did that white working class go? They shifted all the way over to George Wallace, because George Wallace was the only one who was sort of channeling their anger and their frustrations. And so you get this huge shift in this important population, and neither party is really honoring that. Okay, so fast forward that 50, 60 years. You might remember that the most popular podcaster in America is a guy named Joe Rogan. In 2020, Joe Rogan endorsed Bernie Sanders for president. He thought Bernie Sanders was going to tear down the traditional party order. Neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party is seeing the needs of people like him. So Bernie Sanders was his guy. And in 2024, after Bernie Sanders loses, of course, and we have 4 years of Joe Biden, he sides with Donald Trump. And it's not because he necessarily believes in everything Donald Trump wants to do, but he thinks that Donald Trump is going to sort of break down the standard order that we've been living with in a way that no other politician is. So there is this sensibility that neither party has captured this grand centrist tradition that is speaking to the resentments of a large percentage of the American population. And that this vote is so malleable and so shiftable is, A, of all, just a fascinating demographic point, but also should be wildly instructive to the party handlers of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Holy cow, what are these people frustrated by, and how can we meet these resentments without tearing apart the entire country?
Kevin, you've raised so many fascinating questions, but in the interest of time, I think we're going to have to call it there. Once again, that's Professor Kevin M. Schultz from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and the book is Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, Including White Liberals, and I commend it as a thought-provoking read. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to chat.
Rendezvous with History is a podcast produced by the Ronald Reagan Institute's scholarly initiatives. You can learn more at ronaldreaganinstitute.org and follow along on social media at Reagan Institute.